Welcome to the Fat Emperor podcast. I'm your host, Ivor Cummins. Hey guys, I'm back with Professor Michael Levitt, Nobel Prize winner, who has been doing all the mathematics on our viral situation since back in February 2020, before it even started. And overwhelmingly, the analyses have turned out to be quite prophetic, but in some cases, not so much so. So we're going to talk about that in this revisitation. So great to see you again, Michael.
Ivan, it's great to see you. It's really been terrific and, wonderful to be back on your show.
Oh, no, thank you. And we had a great time in London there. We met personally to record for the movie, got a nice lunch. And yeah, it seems like the good old days because that was the summer and look, the thing went away like we expected in the summer. But here we are now. So I guess we'll start with that maybe. As one of the controversial things was you were quite bullish during the summer on Twitter about predicting that the US was coming to a close. Now, Europe certainly was, but the US kind of went on with all kinds of seasonal patterns. So maybe just a quick chat on that one.
So that was really me making a mistake. And the mistake was, and it's a mistake which actually hurts a lot, that I wasn't looking at my own data. We had been putting out these plots every single day, plots which basically show the number of cases or number of deaths, and then superimposed on that a cloud of blue dots, which are different predictions up to that day. And then in a red line, the sort of consensus of those dots. And basically what we saw in Europe starting around mid-April, essentially the blue dots or the red squares predicting what's going to be the endpoint number for that particular outbreak. You obviously can't say anything about other outbreaks, but Europe actually acted like a single outbreak. And what we basically saw was that by mid-April, particularly on the graph, there's a point at 17 of April, the number of cases and the number of deaths had actually sort of converged. They were no longer jumping all over the place. They reached a flat plateau, which ended up being the final values for that first outbreak in Europe, and remained that way until the end of June, beginning of July. That was Europe. If one looks at exactly the same graph for the United States, a little bit further, this is actually taken up till the end of July, one actually sees that in no way do the predicted line lift off the actual line. When the prediction doesn't know what to do, it basically just says, today is the end point. But obviously, this is like saying the end of the world is today. It definitely cannot be the end point. So it's basically saying that the prediction doesn't really understand what's going on. And in the USA, there was no sign of things ending. At the end of the 24th of July, when I actually made my infamous prediction, the red line was stuck hard on the black line. I think I was hoping that my calculations were wrong and that the parallel between Europe and the United States would be stronger. If we now fast forward for the USA today, we actually see that for the first time, the USA is actually showing a pattern where the red line lifts off the black line. Initially, the red line lifts off too much and then it corrects. And looking at this, it looks like the plateau for confirmed cases in the USA is going to be around 30 million cases, and the number of deaths is going to be, just looking at the graph, approximately something like maybe a bit shy of 600,000. Now, these, of course, are reported cases and reported deaths. This whole method is not going on. We're assuming how the reported trajectories work. You basically see like a rocket launch. You see the path of the rocket, and the path of the rocket is basically number of cases or number of reported deaths, and then you can predict from that. So basically, I really made, in some ways, the worst mistake a scientist could make. He didn't look at his data. It, I guess, proves I'm human, which a lot of people would be very happy about. I think it was partially a response to criticism on Twitter, etc. The real situation in the United States is different, and I guess we're going to move on to that in the next section. So that is basically the situation.
Absolutely, Michael. And I know the seasonality as well was only becoming really apparent because we knew the thing had curled over in Europe. For instance, Europe was a simpler model, as you described. We knew it curled over, and I was placing at the time a large credit to community immunity built up, which was true. That was part of it. The passing of the susceptible obviously burns out, in a sense, and that was part of it. But seasonality was also in there, but we didn't know how big it was. And it turns out seasonality was pretty enormous for Europe. It was a huge part of splitting that wave off and then letting it come back in the winter. So seasonality was a tricky one in there. But you know, the human side, I felt it myself on Twitter. You know, you're in an argument, you know you're broadly correct, you know your opponents are being biased and in general they're not correct in a broad sense, and then you double down on your position. I've done it too.
Well, firstly, I remember when I made that tweet at the end of July, almost instantaneously, since either you wrote to me privately or you tweeted, "What about seasonality?" Not so fast. But I still doubled down. And my argument basically was not that reported deaths would go to zero, but that actual excess deaths would go to zero, because that's what happened in Europe when basically saw, and essentially there were COVID deaths continued, reported deaths continued after there were no excess deaths. So excess death is a way of basically avoiding the difficulty of comorbidity. You could argue that if somebody is really sick from cancer and gets COVID, he's probably only a 10% COVID death and a 90% cancer death. No one does the splitting off. And the only way and essentially a person can't die of cancer and then separately die of COVID. It's a single death. So the total number of real deaths as seen by excess death are a way of taking care of the difficulty of classification, which is why I switched to that measure. Well, I was working on it with Euromomo pretty early on. Just getting data has been much harder for the excess death. Mortality.org was a great resource. And in fact, the US CDC, after one discovered how to weed through their files, which are very complicated, actually did have the excess death. And somebody who's been working with me, Ben Martin, I've never met, but he's on Twitter, actually found a way to query the database and actually get the legacy data. So you could say, what did we think for this week 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, or 4 weeks ago? And then be able to see how the backfilling of excess death is working. So it's been interesting.
Yeah, excellent. An excess death. And for a moment, I'll just explain as well. I was surprised at this, but some people actually said that excess death, the term, can confuse some people, even though it seems intuitive to us. But so excess death, if you expect 1,000 deaths in July in a given region, and that's normal and that's generally what you see, but you see 1,100 this month or this July, well, that's 100 excess deaths over what would be expected. And that's all the term excess deaths mean. And it's completely unbiased and you can't fudge the figures. Whereas with PCR positives, you got this complete maelstrom of confusion. So that's pretty much it.
And you're absolutely right. The key thing, I mean, you basically, all the data that you have is total deaths from all causes. You don't, and even when you say excess deaths from COVID, all you're really saying is excess deaths in the COVID season. And this is exactly the same terminology that's used for flu seasons. Every single country monitors excess deaths from flu, because with flu, we're not doing the PCR testing. And the only way you can really tell was it a bad flu year or a good flu year is how many extra deaths there are over what you expect. So the key thing is you get an expectation of death based on history. It can be done in different ways, and the way I found is best is not to say this year is like the previous years, but that the death rate for different age groups is fairly constant. So you actually, on your previous data, using excess death, using total deaths in different age groups and total population in those same age groups, you can work out how many deaths per million if you're 65 to 70, how many deaths per million if you're under 15. And now you get averaged death rates, and then you come to a particular year like 2020, and you apply those death rates to the expected population numbers in 2020. So if, for example, there's been a big increase in 85-year-old plus people over 85, and those people do have higher death rates, your expected deaths would be higher, not because of any disease or any flu, but because of the expected deaths. This also has another corollary. If something occurs every year, then it's going to be washed out of the expected deaths. So let's just imagine that every year there are 100,000, say in all of Europe, 100,000 flu deaths. They will no longer become excess, because when you look at previous years, you will see in every previous year 100,000 flu deaths. Now, if the flu deaths are 100,000, but sometimes they're 200,000, whatever, then you would still see a lot. But things that have occurred historically tend to get washed out by the calculation of expectation. The expectation really is, so I think it's important to realize that it's quite difficult to actually know how many people, by this method, it's quite difficult to know how many people have died from flu in previous years, because flu is always with us. For COVID, it was easier because it's something new. It's also easier because the COVID excess deaths tended to occur at a time when there weren't flu excess deaths, because it was occurring in the springtime.
Yeah, which made it stand out. And also, we have the broader point we'll probably touch on later, that when COVID came in basically all over the world, whether you locked down or not, or didn't matter, flu basically disappeared out of the viral. So we don't know why exactly, but
A
flu
huge surprise
completely
to
went away.
everybody. And I was actually saying, we'll know COVID is over when I start to get colds again. So it wasn't just flu. I mean, colds went away. People are just much less. I mean, I haven't been as healthy as this for a long time. I haven't had a single cold. Maybe I had COVID, but I didn't notice it. So in any case, should we move on to the...
We Absolutely. So these graphs, this is perfect your description. These graphs are age corrected. They're based on several prior years, not just one. That's very misleading. And they're basically have the baseline and then what actually happened. So the excess stands out. And I'll share all the graphs later. But if we go to USA overall first is a good high level one.
Right. So the USA overall, and in these graphs, although 5 age bands were used in the calculation, it makes the graph very confusing. So we simply split the population into young people who are under 65. And a lot of people smile when I say young is under 65. I am almost 74, so actually 65 seems really young to me. And the reason is that there's a very dramatic difference in many countries. People under 65 essentially have had no excess death. The first case we're showing is the United States, and this ties in with what I was saying before about predicting the United States. If you see, for the older people, there's an initial peak that occurred in week 16, which I think is the beginning of April, end of March in the United States. This peak ended in June, but it didn't actually get down to the baseline. I was betting the fact that the red dotted line would actually cross the dashed line. It got close, but it didn't get there. And the reason was, as you can see, there was a second peak building up. So maybe that peak did get down, but it's superimposed by another peak, and that becomes too complicated. There was then a second peak during the summer, less than the peak in the spring, due to seasonality, as you've emphasized so much. And then a third peak, which started in the beginning of October, week 41, 12 weeks before the end of the year. And that peak again peaked. This graph actually is more than a calendar year. It actually goes to the last week for which there's data, which when I made these graphs a week ago was week 6 or 7 of 2021. And what you see overall is that there's been these 3 peaks. The total amount of extra death for people over 65 compared to the average of 2017 to 19 is a little bit less than 1,000 per million, which is 0.1%. For people who are young, it's smaller than that. It's more like 0.04%, 2.5 times smaller, 385 per million. What is striking though with the young people is that the older people show pronounced ups and downs. You can see that the spring peak and the winter peak are much higher than the peak in the middle. But for the young people, the excess death does show a little bit of peaking, but it's much, much flatter. So it's almost like as soon as COVID started, younger people were dying at an increased rate. We can also see here by how much as a percentage, because the baseline for younger people is a bit less than 50, maybe 40. I'm just guessing 45. And it's gone up by about 5 or 6. So it's basically an increase of about 10%. So younger people in the United States between week 13 to a few weeks ago has been elevated by about 10%. For reasons that aren't really clear to me. It's not seasonal, it's not, but then it does, I guess, correspond broadly to when restrictions on COVID were in place. But it's really too hard to say.
Yeah, and I think that one, we won't get into the weeds here on it, but there's a lot of analysis done by the Heart Group and Joelle Smalley in the UK, England, which has seen similar phenomenon. And yeah, a suspicion that denial of care and general impact on care, just leads to this nudging up of mortality, because we all have pride in our hospital systems and our excellent care. And if that's very impacted, there's probably going to be a knock-on effect. So it's probably not too shocking. But a concern with that would be, and it's probably a key point, that if you've got kind of a denial of care for a whole year, you may be building up undiagnosed cancers and all kinds of other conditions more severely, which will cause more COVID deaths in the longer term, because those are the people who are most exposed. So bit of a building up challenge, maybe.
I think the United States CDC, which is the official body, has actually said that of the, I think they find the total if you sum up the actual numbers, not per million, but in total, it comes up to be something like maybe 380,000. Well, for 2020, this is a little bit less than we have here. And the CDC said that of that, about 100,000 is not COVID. I'm not sure how they could be so sure. I guess they're taking reported COVID as being at least an estimate or an overestimate. So, this does indicate that it may well be that the flat part for the younger people, if you just take out the peaks, and also you basically put a small flat part for the older people, that would be lockdowns that seem to be uncorrelated with outbursts of the epidemic and perhaps due to lockdown. And this may end up accounting for maybe as much as a third of the excess death. It also paradoxically or funnily indicates that in fact, at the end of July, the excess death, the real excess death did actually get back to normal, but that's completely besides the point. And I should have looked at my data. My algorithm did not think that the USA had stopped. So that's it. Should we move on to the next one?
Oh, we can indeed. And just one last quick thing on that before we go on. Professor John Ioannidis, who I know you've a good friendship with, and I've been following him for many years before COVID on his research. Incredible man. He came up with the 0.2% generally, or 0.23 fatality rate, which is 2,000 per million. And in America, it was only, I say only, around 1,000 per million in the whole year of COVID of 2020. And the figure for below 70 years was 0.05. Those figures were very close from like way back in April.
And those numbers were estimated essentially from the Diamond Princess. In fact, my friendship with John has been very strange because I hadn't actually followed his work. He'd done a lot of very interesting work on why most scientific papers are wrong and why petitions fail and so on, but I just hadn't done so. And I was very focused on my own science. But then both of us totally independently looked at the Diamond Princess, and basically a very simple extrapolation from the Diamond Princess gives you this number of 1,000 per million. I actually wrote about it in the Medium on the 22nd of March, and he, I think, wrote about it in Stat News about exactly the same time. And I just wasn't, I had been used to thinking about the epidemic as a Chinese phenomenon, and I wasn't really plugged into reading it, but I was sending my reports on China to a co-worker of Ioannidis, Eran Ben David, who's actually on most of his papers. And I think John, John saw my papers, and when we met for the first time just a few months ago, we were like instant friends. So it's a funny feeling, and recently he wrote and said, it feels like we've known each other for a long time. So basically, in some ways, if you think alike, maybe you are more alike a little bit like you and I think. So it's a strange story.
Oh, oh, I don't think so now. I wouldn't even approach your level
Well, no, no, no,
of
no, no. But you have to
commitment.
understand that the key thing is curiosity. And I don't believe you can do protein molecular dynamics the way that I can. But thinking out of the box and thinking with common sense is surprisingly rare. And I think that probably the three of us are all characterized by that. And I think it's very important to understand that, education is completely different from thinking out of the box common sense. We're basically dealing with the situation. I mean, maybe John was the most qualified because he is the most cited epidemiologist in the world. Generally loves to think out of the box. He's not very happy about Twitter these days, but that's the way it is, I guess. I think I have a pretty thick skin, so it didn't really bother me too much.
Well, we're certainly alike in that regard. I've developed a titanium skin, I call it. I'm literally, my resilience at this stage is not even the slightest flagged. And I had a propaganda campaign against me, newspapers and everything in January. So, but anyway, I'm not bragging about it. I'm just letting my opponents know.
One good thing is that in science, you're used to being criticized, usually in a constructive way, but not always. And what you learn is that any criticism, no matter how well or unwell it's meant, is actually very helpful. If I were to come to if someone were to come and look at my work and say, okay, there's an error on this page, completely randomly, I would look at that page and I would definitely find an error. So, you can't help it. There are errors everywhere, and people being critical is actually very powerful. And I think I actually like this about Twitter because it actually makes me check things more carefully. Obviously, I'm still making mistakes all the time. And, there's also sometimes the feeling of I'm going to do this because people want to hear it. It's actually very refreshing to do science for Twitter. I guess I don't really need to worry too much about my long-range publication record anymore. But it really is fun, even just having 3 or 4 people who are listening to it. Right now, I've managed to get 3 or 4 people actually to collaborate and do work. We share files and they do work. And, I don't know who these people are. I've not met them. But it's actually a really nice feeling because I think that common sense and analyzing numbers is something that you don't have to be a specialist in a certain field to do. Numbers for themselves make a certain sense. And I think that sense can be brought out. So in this graph, we now look at 2 US states, 2 big states, the state of New York, with a population, I think, of around 20 million, and the state of Texas, which I think is 30 million. And these 2 states are actually similar in some ways, but different in other ways. Basically, New York New York City, in fact, but New York as a state as well, was very, very badly hit and hit very early. In fact, it was New York City that actually got me onto Twitter. I had an account on Twitter for complaining about airlines and credit cards, but never used it for anything interesting. And in March, when the number of deaths in New York started to increase, the New York City mayor's website only gave today's deaths, and yesterday's data disappeared. It wasn't like but of course, any kind of analysis of the trajectory of an epidemic requires the time series of days, deaths yesterday, deaths the day before. So I actually sent a tweet to the mayor's office asking whether this data was available. I didn't know I have an email. And what shocked me or surprised me in a very pleasant way is I immediately got a lot of emails back from people inside the mayor's office anonymously sending me the data. So I realized that although I only had 20 or 30 followers at that time, this tweet was read by many people whom I had no idea whom they were. And I suddenly realized this is incredible. This is like having a private research team for you. So to get back to New York State, and New York City is similar, but it's difficult to compare a city to a state. New York State has a very, very pronounced peak in the spring, both in people over 65, the pink curve, and people under 65, the green curve, and a much, much smaller peak at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. Again, the baseline is exactly the same average of mortalities over the previous 3 years applied to the actual population of the state. What's interesting, I guess, is that after week 21, I think that is around the beginning of May when my birthday is, things just stopped and didn't pick up again until the flu season started at the end of October, week 49. Texas was different. Texas didn't have very much until it had a summer peak starting in June at week 25. That peak was then followed again by the peak at the end of the year. And, we have these two peaks. In both cases, there's a fair amount of young people, young being under 65, who seem to have deaths that actually correlated with the outbreak. Unlike what we saw for the whole country, in New York State, once the deaths of the older people stopped, the deaths of the younger people stopped as well. A curious thing here is to actually look at the dashed line, the pink dashed line, which shows the dependence by week of the natural deaths in New York City or New York State. And in fact, the dashed line, both for New York State and for Texas, is around 100 per million per week, which is sort of what you expect. But basically, the fluctuation in New York is very flat. New York doesn't show much of a flu season. For reasons that aren't clear to me, Texas actually shows a more pronounced flu season. We don't really understand why that is.
Well, and another point from that baseline where it's not too dramatic seasonally, this disease specifically targets kind of diabetic, insulin resistant, leptin resistant, and the aged. But again, much of the aged target is because they are insulin resistant and have these issues and they're immuno kind of suppressed really with their age. But it may be the flu not so much targeting those specific people, and that's why this one is more seasonal against the baselines for these areas, because they have a lot of those people. Texas, in New York, going to have an enormous amount of metabolic disease.
Yeah. I think that said, by and large, if you look at the age profile of mortality, of the excess mortality, which we would say is due to COVID. I mean, we don't know it's due to COVID, but it's mortality in the period of COVID. That excess mortality is actually tracks quite closely the natural mortality. In other words, areas that have a lot of natural death tend to have higher COVID deaths, and areas that have very little natural death have much less COVID death. So in some ways, COVID is, for every age group, quite similar to natural death. One of the reasons it's been so hard to identify whether somebody has died of COVID or not. I mean, if people dying of COVID were all 20 years old, it would be very easy to know what a COVID death is. But since the people dying with COVID have a spectrum of susceptibility, which basically tracks the susceptibility as it increases with age. But not only does it track that, it also tracks, some countries, for example, have more robust old people. Some countries have much, much more robust young people. This could be due to the healthcare system. It could be due to different populations. But for example, and we will see this in a bit, the excess mortality for young people in the United States is much, much higher than in Europe. In fact, if we look at New York, the level of excess mortality is almost, nothing. And the actual baseline excess mortality, you can see in New York, the baseline is at about 30, whereas in Texas, it's about 50. And we're going to see this trend occurring again and again. Certain areas seem to have a more healthy young population. And in some ways, New York is probably the most European, or the northeast of the United States is much more European than anywhere else. We've now taken New York and Texas and actually put them onto the same scale. Pink Peak, which is very, very substantial in New York State, is really small in Texas. In New York State, the peak of the pink is something like 4 or 5 times the background level. In Texas, at its worst, which actually was in the summer, it's less than double the background. It's maybe 60% higher. So in one case, you have an increase of 400 or 500%. In the other case, an increase of maybe 40%. just
Yeah.
showing that New York really was a tough situation.
Intense. And yet, interestingly, I found it very interesting at the time that they had a ship in the bay and all excess capacity. And even though they had that intensity, they never actually really used their excess capacity. So they had no lockdown, no preparation, a complete mess, and massive peaks. And still they handled it through their system without the extra. So it kind of just shows you.
That's a very good point, and it's a point which, in principle, should have been read by everybody, because basically the justification for lockdown initially was to save the healthcare system. And we had seen in Italy maybe a less well-controlled situation. It was the first. It had no warning. And then shortly, New York City, which in some ways is a smaller area, maybe made it easier to infect everybody early on, geographically, but, had, some of the best hospitals in the world. Probably as a city, there's probably no city in the world that has as good hospitals as New York City. These are the best hospitals in the world. And you're right, there was panic, maybe over-treatment in certain cases, but in fact, we didn't have hospital overload, and that should have been the lesson for all the countries with subsequently locked down to protect their hospitals, that this wasn't going to be a problem. I think it was a very, I would say that there were two really important lessons here that were missed. One was that in Sweden, basically, like we said about the British during the Second World War, stiff upper lip and just hang on and just see what happens. Sweden did that and basically came out of it fine. And New York City, it was like, this is the worst possible thing that could happen. And yet nothing happened. The peak levels, as we'll see later in the United Kingdom, were bad, but they were never more than 100% of baseline. Being at, for New York State, at a level of 5 times the baseline, and for New York City, actually 7 times the baseline, is unprecedented. And yet, as you said, we survived. And I think that is a very, very important lesson.
And just another adder for that, and I've been saying it for months now, the irony is in Ireland as well, we built the excess capacity, and in the UK, the Nightingales, massive expense. It was never used, and then it was all taken apart in the summer, simultaneous to the messaging being we are heading for a massive second wave like the Spanish flu, and then they were disbanded, all the hospitals. Not a single extra place was kept while heading for the winter resurgence. So incredibly, they spent probably 50 times more on lockdown impacts, and they decided to spend nothing on expanding the capacity of the very system which was the threat of being overwhelmed. So the logic in this, we won't go on, but the logic makes zero sense. The engineering solution would have been, of course, to maintain your excess capacity, cross-train staff. You've got limited ICU nurses. They take years to train, but you don't train ICU nurses full style. You train auxiliaries who have the capability to support the system. This is easy. In industry and engineering, we do this kind of crisis management and proactive, preparation for issues all the time. But none of it was done. Isn't that fascinating? All over Europe, not a shred.
And in addition to what you said, the Chinese built 2 field hospitals in 10 days, which was a wonderful brag. But they didn't use those hospitals. They may be around. Another thing about hospital capacity, because we've had global warming, and Northern Hemisphere particularly has warmed enormously, looking at the North Pole cap and so on, there's been less flu deaths in the Northern Hemisphere for the last decade. Now, this means that hospitals are not getting overflown. They're not overflowing the way they used to overflow 10 years ago. And as a result, any smart accountant is going to say, okay, we never reach 80% capacity. Shouldn't we cut back a bit? Shouldn't we outsource some of those beds to specialized care? I was told this happened to a very large extent in Italy. Money comes from specialized care for elderly people who have money. Whether it's knee replacements or hip replacements or facelifts, there's a lot of money in that. Or even cancer therapy for the last few years, antibody therapy for cancer. This is where all the money is. There's no money in antibiotics. There's no money up till now, at least in vaccines. And therefore, the hospitals have generally, if you look at the track hospital beds in Europe, they've gone down steadily. People kept on thinking that this wave of immortality brought on by global warming would keep on continuing. But like a sand pile, what was happening was every year we were leaving more and more people who would have died of the flu alive, people who were naturally vulnerable, until the sand pile tipped. And again, complex systems engineers all know this. You can't keep on making the O-ring thinner and thinner until the rocket crashes. And I do think that one of the really good things about engineering is about the possible, and it's about thinking about everything. In other words, an engineering system is as strong as its weakest link. And I think engineering would be a wonderful, statesmanship should be a form of engineering with exactly the same issues of balance. There's no point in saying never a COVID death. We can have as many cancer deaths as you like. We can have as many flu deaths as you like, but never a COVID death. This is something that an engineer would never ever say. They would say, well, it's like saying, as long as the brakes don't fail, I don't care how unsafe the car is. Well, that's stupid. So
it's crazy. And just to your reference to the shuttle there, I think in the O-rings and the disaster, what happened? Well, they made sure the O-rings were resolved. But the irony is, and I'll have to restate it here, in this case, the O-rings, right, were kind of close to failure, but not failing. And then after the first wave, they basically took out the O-rings and put in really skinny ones. They never even learned. So that's a fascinating phenomenon. They never even learned in the short term between the waves. Never mind the decades where they let the system and the sand rise and the system become less capable. But yeah, so the next ones, I have them printed here.
This is Florida and California. Before we go there, I just wanted to say that in fact the second waves, fortunately, were not nearly as bad as one might have expected, particularly because flu went away, because the second waves now occur in the winter season. And since flu's gone away, the actual excess death in the second waves are not as bad as they could have been. So, hospitals, if we'd had flu at the same time as COVID in the second wave, hospitals really would have had a hard time. But again, it doesn't take away from the fact that this could have been thought about and prevented.
Yeah. And just one last pointlet on that point. It was kind of clear that the flu had exited the building anyway, but also the same people who are going to be susceptible to COVID in your next wave are kind of the same people susceptible to flu. So, like, you can only die twice. You can only get sick, you can only die once. You can only get sick once. It was kind of obvious that flu is not going to be a major issue. It just wasn't entirely clear how big COVID would be. But again, no hospital increase, and they took down all of the extra capacity.
In terms of flu and COVID, and again, this is something which, just even mentioning the two in the same YouTube is caused to be banned. Basically, I think what I had shown really quite early, maybe in April, that the excess death from flu and COVID had a very, very similar age structure. In both cases, this is from Euromomo, in both cases, only 8% were less than 65, and about half were over 85. And this is true both of flu and of COVID. So evidence for the fact that these populations overlap is that they have exactly the same age structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so now moving back to the United States, we're going to compare. I mean, in some ways, we're very fortunate that this data is available for the whole of the United States, thanks to the CDC. In order to get this age-corrected excess death, one actually needs the total deaths, all-cause death in different population bands. One also needs the actual populations. And again, this information is available centrally for the United States. Unfortunately, in Europe usually being more transparent than the United States, a lot of the excess death data is very hidden in Europe. Euromomo has the data, but you have to be a hacker to get the data. And, it shouldn't be like this. Nothing is more indicative of public health than all-cause death and, and populations. And these data should be publicly available for everyone. And I think this is something which needs to change. Okay, getting back to the United States, we're looking here at two states, two large states. I think California is the largest state with around 40 million population. Florida has, I think, about 20 million, maybe 25 million population or something like that. And they show interesting patterns. They're both southern states, one in the southeast, the other in the southwest, or the west coast and east coast. Florida, I think, was hit with a large summer wave. Their first wave peaks exactly, well, maybe just slightly in August, peaks at week 31, which I think is end of August. It's pretty sharp. There's a peak for older people. You can see there that the peak height is 200. The baseline is maybe 140. So the peak is only maybe 30 or 40% above baseline. Remember, New York was 500%. Some younger people also dying. And then a second peak, which came later. Now, what was interesting about the second peak is it came after the governor of Florida had bravely decided to release all restrictions. So basically, around week, it was the end of, I think you said the 25th of September. I know that
35 maybe. I think they were down just before that flat period, or just coming into that low.
And I know that there was a conversation that the governor actually had with Brian Kuldorf, Jay Bachahara, and myself, where we basically said that we felt pretty confident. But then he did something, it's very easy for a scientist to say what they're confident about. For a governor to actually do it is much more difficult. But he did it, and the deaths went up. But in fact, the outcome in Florida was something like 1,300 total deaths per million, maybe almost 1,350. But we have to remember that Florida actually has a high natural mortality. And we'll see this in a second. Now, if we come to compare California, and one thing you should just remember, the baseline for Florida is at 150. That scale is a little bit arbitrary because it's per week, and I forget exactly how we normalize it, but I'll fix it. In California, the scale is at 100. So basically, just pure natural mortality is 50% higher in Florida than it is in California. So we need to remember that. Come to California, a tiny wave in the spring when they locked down. California, I believe, locked down in mid-March. So when New York got bad, California locked down. And I think they locked down quite well, particularly Northern California. Then they had something in the summer, and you could say that they should have relaxed things in the summer, because in the summertime, however you cut it, respiratory diseases are less severe, and hospitals are much emptier. But they didn't. And then finally, towards the end of the year, in October, week 43, things got bad again and have now come down again. So basically, the net result is that California and Florida have quite similar total excess deaths. I think Florida is again about 1,300. I'm not going to try to do this. I think it's actually very similar. 760 plus 480. Of course, the Florida you'd expect a higher death because of the natural baseline. But in the end, it didn't really help that California did all these restrictions, because in fact, COVID eventually took over. Now, what's interesting is to look at the young people. So basically, like we saw for all of the United States, at the very beginning, excess deaths start in California. Although there's excess deaths for people in the green curve under 65. And they remain fairly constant, but at a relatively high level compared to what you're seeing for the old people. So for example, at week 25, the percentage excess death for younger people is a lot higher, maybe double as high as it is for the older people over 85. And then for the big peak, which peaks on the first week of January 7th, we're basically seeing a pretty large peak for old people, still much less than double. So it's less than 100% increase, much less than we saw in New York, but actually is accompanied by quite a large peak for young people. Again, double. And this we don't understand. It's not clear why the young people were so badly hit. This peak was essentially in Southern California. In Northern California, things haven't peaked at all in this third wave.
Yeah, that's pretty notable, and I hadn't noticed that until I got your graph sent to me last night, and I hadn't seen it come up. But yeah, that's the most notable young person graph I've seen for a spike. It's unusual, and I'm sure people will make reasons for it, but it's just something to note. I might just circle back to Florida. The interesting thing was I was using Florida as an exemplar of the lockdown and mask mandates being dropped completely when you had that meeting with the governor. And for many, many weeks afterwards, I think 6 or 7 weeks I got up to with no notable increase in deaths. And you know the way it's 2 to 3 weeks for deaths to increase if you take out a measure? But I got up to 7 weeks with no notable increase, which proved that the lockdown dropping, that nothing really happened. But then, of course, Florida began to trigger. And again, I would say that's an environmental, seasonal, complex viral triggering thing. But again, not really linked to the lockdowns, you know. And California was the most severely locked down all the way through and super severe when they began to have a problem, you know, in this so-called second wave. And yet, what? No outcome effectively, or no real outcome.
And I think this raises the issue of a saturation threshold, because in the end, although the
Yeah.
seasonality was different, Florida and California ended up having very similar total numbers of excess death overall per million. And this number, I think, is like corresponds to 0.13% of population, 1,300 out of a million. And, you know, that number is in there with the range of what we've been thinking about for the population fatality ratios ever since we analyzed the Diamond Princess. So, you know, and this may not be the number. The Diamond Princess was looked at over a short period. People weren't on the boat for a year, and we don't really know what happened to them afterwards. So, you know, that number is not set in stone. We don't really know what the population fatality ratio is. Again, for influenza, normally this number is actually given for a single year. And we're now looking at something like 14 months of COVID. So we expect the number to increase proportionately. For flu, all the numbers are given as deaths per population million per year. Obviously, if you wait long enough, you will have any number of deaths you want. So it needs to be curtailed in time. I'm going to move to the, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Oh, just one quick thing. I think for kind of Europe, some countries hit much worse than others, but 1,000 per year was the nominal for Europe and USA, and that compares to the couple of billion people in China, Japan, and Australia, New Zealand, you know, and Oceania. That whole region of the world with lesser lockdowns and masks on average, they had around 30 per million. And over in Europe and America for the year, we were around 1,000 per million. So it's still only 0.1%, but it's interesting. The most lockdown masked areas are kind of 30 times higher impact, rough and tough. But yeah.
I think the whole issue of what I call the East Asian sector, which is basically Oceania and East Asia, a sector close to the line of longitude coming down, say, through Beijing, or that whole area has been amazingly resistant to COVID. Wuhan, the city of Wuhan is the one exception. I think in some ways, one way to think about COVID resistance, and this is an analogy which I don't like to use because I'm comparing fire to trees, fire of trees to people and COVID, but it's something we understand, is that in some ways the trees in the forests of China are wetter than the ones, or not as dry as the ones in Europe. And therefore they can be ignited, the ones in Europe can be ignited more easily. But if you get a really hot flame, like you had in New York City, or you had in Wuhan City, where people have been generally infected and then suddenly panic, I think you can get many more of the trees to burn. And so and this is why I think Wuhan, nowhere else in China was there anything like this. I was involved with China from the very beginning, and it was clear right at the beginning that the case fatality ratio, number of people or cases who die was 10 times higher, even initially 15 times higher in Wuhan than in the rest of China. People left Hubei province before it was locked down, many millions, maybe 2 or 3 million, to the rest of China. And the people in Wuhan ended up leading to almost all the deaths. Although the number that left were quite a high number, the deaths per case outside Wuhan were around even less than 1 in 100, maybe 1 in 200. Inside Wuhan, they were 1 in 10. So there was a massive disparity there. And I think that, again, I am not that surprised that there are no deaths in China. They have very, very tight control of quarantines and things like that. Vietnam didn't have this and had no deaths. Taiwan is an island, it was locked down. But, Japan and South Korea were much less locked down. New Zealand is apparently I did see somebody, I haven't checked this, but apparently New Zealand never suffers much in global epidemics. They didn't even suffer much from the 1918 flu. They are so isolated that their lockdown, I don't think, proves anything other than, I guess, the country can survive very well without tourists. But I think that both Australia, I think, again, was easily controlled. Australia actually has something like 10,000 negative excess deaths. So Australia this year, by locking down, as did New Zealand, saved a lot of lives. There was also no flu there. I don't think it was worth it.
Yeah. No, it would have seemed to be absurd given the age kind of distribution of who's affected. No disrespect, but it's absurd. But also Australia, and I think New Zealand did get hit pretty hard in 19, that doesn't get talked about much. But the other thing is Australia. I had people in Australia, and around April, they were saying to me, wow, you guys are locking down way harder than us over here, in Ireland, like kilometre limits. So Australia, maybe it's overestimated how much lockdown they really did. But then things got very political and there was a lot of focus on specific hotspots. I think if we did a T-cell assay on the population in Australia and New Zealand, I think we might see a lot more exposure that occurred over the prior 12 months than is being perceived. But we don't have that data.
I think, in fact, the analysis of T-cell receptor subtypes, which can easily be done by PCR, would be one of the most important things to have globally. I think that we will find that this is the one thing that correlates with susceptibility. I mean, it's also the thing biologically. If your body can recognize COVID viruses better and deal with them, call the alarm, and for whatever reason, this has not been looked at. And in fact, I was talking to a faculty member at Stanford yesterday. We actually talked not over Zoom, but by walking around together. And this is what he's working on. And, it's something which certainly could be afforded by China. They could take a random sampling and look at T cells. And I guess it's probably not going to happen. Let's move on to the Dakotas now, if you don't mind. So here we have on the left, South Dakota state in the United States, on the right, North Dakota. And however you look at them, they are almost identical. Both of them have relatively small populations, so there's a lot of fluctuation. The curves are very smooth for big states and much less smooth just because of the counting errors. The baselines are very similar. For the older people, around 150. For the younger people, maybe 30. So these states are almost identical. The total deaths per million are high, around 2,000 per million, almost identical in both of these states. Yet the lockdown measures were very, very different. I think North Dakota, I remember one of them released lockdown, one didn't, yet the outcome was exactly the same. Am I right, Ivor?
Yeah, I'd have to say you're correct. I call it an almost perfect natural experiment because they've around 1 million people each. So the N is plenty big to look at this. They have 2,000 deaths per million, approximate, the classic 0.2%. So they got pretty saturated. They're the same peoples and the same geography, same region. It's a perfect split. But South Dakota, the governor there, an extraordinary lady, no lockdowns, no business closures, effectively no masks, no mask mandates. And I was sent from people in South Dakota Pictures right during this period, the worst period, in bars, no masks, having a good time. North Dakota, however, did the full lockdown and hardcore masks and closed businesses right through it. But as you say, pick the lockdown success story. But we see this, I think, and the important thing is not to be too hard on lockdowns. They will have an effect. The question is how much effect. And the cost is enormous. And it's looking like from around 30 analyses all over the world, which look at 50, 60, 80 countries, 190 countries. All these analyses look at way more than North and South Dakota or Florida and Canada. And the ultimate answer at the end is no real signal, guys, for deaths per million relating to lockdown. So we got to face some realities.
What I wanted to say is what is interesting about both of the Dakotas is that they come down quite early. I mean, they're dropping rapidly before the end of the year. So as winter is coming in, their numbers are plunging. Most other, if you look at previously at California and Florida, they still have a significant number of excess deaths into 2021, whereas the Dakotas have nothing. It's also interesting that the young people under 65 in the second wave or the main wave are almost identical. Both of them are elevated. It's a noisy curve, but in both places, the number of excess deaths for younger people is quite high. It's around 500. So again, this is telling us maybe something about what lockdown is really doing. I'm going to move to the next one, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is, I guess, closer to home. I have multiple citizenships and therefore feel at home in many places. And here we have, on the left, England and Wales, and on the right, UK, Northern Ireland, both on the same vertical scale. The 250 deaths per million line is lined up. We see that England was really quite badly hit in the first wave. Again, going back to New York, I think it is slightly more than 100%. So on week 17, England, the high point is something like 330 and the baseline 150. So 330 divided by 150 is over twice. So the high point is twice the average. In New York, as a whole, it was 5 times, New York State. So again, not the same. A relatively small number of younger people, say, compared to what we were seeing in United States, and then quite a modest second wave. It's also important to see that there's actually an undershoot. If you look at the number of, or pull forward, the number of excess deaths in the summer, weeks 23 to 33, are actually negative. So some of the people who died in the main wave are not dying subsequently. But essentially, one main wave, I think I would guess that the total number of deaths in the second wave is certainly less than the first wave. The total number of both waves and both ages is around 1,300, the same number that we saw in California and in Florida. So these are badly hit countries. The average is less than 1,000 per million. So that's the case. And Northern Ireland, on the same scale, is definitely less. The sum of the excess deaths per million is closer to 700, about half. Again, you can see it's a much smaller population. It's much more noisy. Something in the second wave, but again, nothing that's really surprising. And again, very little excess death for people under 65, just 165 per million.
Yeah, and my comments there are certainly I got a lot of heat about the second wave in England being bigger than we had expected. But I mean, we called out as far back as August that it could be substantial, but it's not going to be like the first one. So I think we see it was bigger than expected, but analyses done showed that the areas least affected in the first one were most affected in the second. So it wasn't at saturation. But a key point here, that England got super hard hit and across 2 full seasons and kind of straddling 2 years, they're only at around maybe excess of 13 or 1400 per million, which is 0.13%. And that's the actual real world impact of COVID on mortality. And it's 0.13%. Uh, this gives the scale of this thing really for people.
I think it's important to realize that, and I think that you know, England having the second wave occur in the wintertime during flu season without flu is one of the reasons why the actual excess death is maybe lower than the reported COVID cases for the second wave, because they include, I mean, many of the people who are reported to have died of COVID would have died from flu. So we have this kind of flu displacement factor at play here.
Yeah.
One thing
And
we don't
that,
have is I don't have the data for the Republic of Ireland, and you know, Euromomo
I
does have the data, and it seems to be a bit worse, I think, for the second wave, right?
Yeah, we have the RIP.ie, which luckily tracks informally and it correlates excellently with the ultimate figures. And I'd say it's similar to Northern Ireland for the first wave at a glance, and the second wave a bit bigger. So maybe the second like the first in Republic of Ireland, similar size. But the reality is that Republic of Ireland's epidemic last April 2020, even though there was a hump in excess, the first 7 months of the year is no different than prior years compare. And I think it's going to be the same this year. So even though you've got the hump, when you average it out over the year, it's just not going to be much of a signal. So the whole thing, you've got to come back to the same question. With these kinds of 0.1% over 2 seasons and 2 years, impacts in mortality, and the hospitals never, even though they're not expanded, hitting the capacity, you've got to ask, what is this really about in some ways? Who's running this show?
The point you raise actually is true and seen from these graphs for both England and Northern Ireland, in that until week 13, which I believe is the beginning of April, there's actually negative excess death. In other words, this was a very, very weak flu season. And therefore, people who would normally have expired from flu were still alive and therefore frail. So I think we're definitely seeing an effect. This is seen in a number of countries, but is also something which ends up reducing the annual impact, and I think fairly so. I'm going to move on to
Last one.
well, the second last, but maybe the last one. This here we compare Italy and Israel, and it's an interesting comparison, not just because they both be, I guess, almost adjacent in the alphabet, but because Israel all along greatly feared becoming another Italy. And we can certainly see, looking at the curves, that this doesn't happen. Natural mortality in Israel is a lot less than Italy. Italy has natural mortality at around 200, Israel around 100. So Israel people, because the population is younger, but also for the older people. I mean, the older people in Israel are younger. They have a less of a death than the younger people are. So it's not just, Israel has less death, not just because the whole population is younger, but for whatever reason, maybe the older people are less old. We don't know about that.
Or healthier.
Or
They may
healthier.
be much
Or
healthier.
healthier is certainly an indication as well. But this is something I hadn't noticed up till now. I know that the overall mortality for Israel is half of that of Italy, but it's rather surprising that the baseline for the pink curves in Italy are over 200 at the beginning of the year, and Israel exactly a half. So this is surprising. In Italy, we do have these two peaks. If you actually look in Italy, data was actually given in Italy, reported data for all the, I think 20 provinces of Italy, or maybe 21. I think it's 20, maybe 19. I forget now. It's 20 provinces of Italy. And then what you generally find is that counties or states, Italian regione, that were badly hit in the first wave and not hit in the second wave, and vice versa. So the second wave was much more southern Italy, the first wave more northern Italy. In some ways, the geography of the country does control the natural spread of a virus. A long, thin country, it takes the virus a lot longer to move from top to bottom. In a country which is more circular, they all get hit at about the same time. So regionality, I guess England, Wales, and Scotland also is a long, thin object. So the two waves can be more disjoint. Israel is interesting. This is a country where I'm actually also a citizen. Early on, I felt that there would not be anything like the people early on were claiming that the deaths in Israel would be tens or hundreds of thousands. I felt that this is a huge exaggeration. I said something stupid where on a rather annoying radio show, I said I would be surprised if there were more than 10 deaths, and there certainly are more than 10 deaths. And I have a regular hate mail fan who every time the death goes up by one sends me a new email. But he's about the only one who keeps on doing this. But Israel definitely does have some excess death, not very much. If you see for people under 65, it's minus 31. So the younger people have actually benefited. I guess if you close down the country, there are going to be less work-related accidents, people are having more of a good time. For the elderly, it's also not very high. It's less than 200 out of a million, 0.02%. This is 1/10 the level we're seeing in the Dakota. So Israel really hasn't been hit very hard. It's interesting because Israel was in some ways became the poster child for vaccinations. Israel is now, I think, more than half the country has been vaccinated twice. And I think it might have been an unfortunate choice because a country, maybe South Dakota would have been a much better choice for vaccination because in Israel, there really hasn't been such a huge amount of COVID. There are a couple of peaks before the middle of the year. Both of these are heat waves, as was announced by the Israeli Bureau of Information. There is a second wave, which actually does comprise of most of the deaths. For some surprising reason, this wave drops precipitously around week 43, which is the end of October. And I have no idea why. It builds up again in January. Vaccinations in Israel started in the second or third last week of December, so in weeks 50, 51. At a time when things were quite low, things increased after that point, but are coming down again. And, I really wish that the data in Israel was treated, more preciously. There is evidence that of the people who died with COVID, more and more of them are vaccinated, but this is true of the whole population. And it's also not clear how we're defining a COVID death. You have to first test. And are we testing this carefully? So I think that what should have been done, and it's not a very difficult thing to do, but it might be politically unacceptable, is test everyone who dies by PCR. And if they die with PCR on them, with PCR positive, it's a COVID death. And then just see how those numbers changed. That's something you could have done easily. So, okay.
I'm conscious you have to come to a close, so we'll absolutely finish with this as the last graph. The other graphs were only the Eastern Europeans who never got a first wave and then they got a second wave, regardless of their lockdown policy. So that was interesting, but we'll leave that. And Israel then, the final point, there's vaccines pseudo-mandatory, green passports, all this kind of stuff going on. But their impact on mortality was around 200 per million in total, 0.02%. It just seems, I don't know, Twilight Zone to me.
I agree. Unfortunately, the whole of COVID is political in terms of the treatment, and certain countries have had higher political tensions. The USA and Israel are both involved in elections. I think Israel will have had two elections during the time of COVID, one in March last year and one in March this year. Very close elections, and unfortunately, elections tend to polarize people. But in some ways, I do think it's important to know a lot more about the vaccine. And Israel could have been, choosing a country that decides to vaccinate all its people would have been a good thing to do. It's like having a great clinical trial, but it needs to be done in a very dispassionate way, where you're trying to say, we don't know what the vaccine is doing. How much has it improved things? It's actually a hard thing to find, because you were saying that in Israel, the deaths from COVID are 0.02%. So let's imagine the vaccines abolish all of that. It's quite hard to see that against the background. And I made a joke, let's say you vaccinated everybody, people would still die. So, if everyone's vaccinated, you are still going to have, in Israel, 45,000 deaths of vaccinated people every year. It doesn't prove anything. It just simply proves that people keep on dying.
They do. And maybe we can go back, hopefully, in the future and get some reality back around the reality of death and the circle of life that we had up until March 2020, whereupon we all became terrified of death suddenly, even though the death had only gone up by 0.1% and an average age close to 80 of those deaths. But here we are. So
As they say in Israel, from your lips to God's ears. So
hopefully, or to the World Economic Forum's ears, or whoever else they talk about.
it was great talking, and I think
Yeah.
this is a very productive format. And I wanted to thank you very much. I certainly learned a lot of things about my own graphs that I hadn't noticed before. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Michael, and the best wishes to you now on your trip. I know in a couple of days you're going traveling yet again, and to Shoshan. I can never do it properly.
Roshan, yeah.
Shoshan. Great stuff, and we'll meet again in real life as soon as possible when this whole
In
thing
Ireland or
passes.
wherever we can find. Anyway, thanks very much. I will stop the recording and I will wait. I'll send it to you. I've got to go quickly to do some stuff, but when I get back, I'll send it to you. Thank you, Ivor.
And just a reminder that I do need support to continue putting together all of this content. And at patreon.com/Ivor Cummins, or for PayPal, please see the description below this video or the pinned comment. And you can do a one-off or a monthly support. So I'd really appreciate that, guys, and keep me getting the science out there and countering perhaps the more biased corporate type science. Thank you.